Hello everyone, enjoy your viewing.
It was a quiet morning, the type where the sun gently pierced through the kitchen curtains, casting a soft glow on the table. I was in my element preparing breakfast. The sizzling sound of potatoes frying in the pan, the smell of herbs in the air, it was a comfort. The way mornings used to be when everything felt right. But then the phone rang. I hadn't expected it. Phones hadn't been ringing much lately, at least not for anything good. I wiped my hands on my apron and grabbed the receiver. "Mom, we need to talk." The voice on the other end was cool, distant, and unfamiliar despite the familiarity. It was my son, David. My stomach clenched. Something was wrong. "David? What's the matter?" I asked, trying to steady my voice, but my hands betrayed me as they shook just slightly. There was a long pause. Pause that felt too long. "Mom, it's about the apartment," he finally spoke. "You know, the one that's yours. Your inheritance. I need your help with some documents. Claire and we've hit a rough patch financially. We were hoping your place could solve some of our problems." A cold shiver ran down my spine. Not again. It wasn't the first time they'd asked for help, but this time felt different. It wasn't a question, it was more of an expectation and entitlement. A quiet demand masked as a favor. I stood there, frozen, staring at the countertop. 1,000 thoughts raced through my head. I had worked so hard for what I had. The sacrifices. The years of quiet struggle. And now David, my own flesh and blood, was asking me to hand over what little I had left. I took a deep breath. "No," I said, the word feeling foreign in my mouth but necessary. "No, David, I can't do that." There was a silence that followed, the kind that stretched thin and then snapped. "Mom, this is important. You don't understand. Claire and we really need this. You have to help us." I shook my head, my fingers gripping the phone tighter. "I've given enough, David. All these years I've helped. But no more. I won't be used like this." I hung up before he could say another word. The house felt colder suddenly, even though the sun was still streaming through the window. I sat down at the table, my mind swirling in the quiet after the storm. David had crossed a line and I knew it. For years I had been the one to give, to support, to be the one everyone leaned on. But the more I gave, the more they took. It was never enough. They always came back for more, as if I owed them something. But I didn't. I had worked for every penny, every bit of security I had built for myself. And yet, they had never learned to see that. They only saw what I could give them. I knew then that things had to change. This was the moment. I wasn't going to sit by anymore, hoping they'd realize the sacrifices I had made. I wasn't going to let them take what was rightfully mine. I stood up from the table, my heart pounding, my hands steadying as I made my decision. I wasn't going to wait for another call, another manipulation, another attempt to make me feel guilty for not giving more. That afternoon, I went to the bank and gathered every document I had. My inheritance, my apartment, everything. They weren't going to use it as a bargaining chip anymore. I left the bank with a sense of finality, the weight of my decision sitting heavily on my shoulders but lifting something else from my chest. A new chapter was beginning, one where I was in control, where my life no longer revolved around their needs. When I got home, I sat down in the quiet of my living room, the papers in front of me. It was strange, this feeling of empowerment, like I had taken back something precious that had been slipping through my fingers for far too long. And this was just the beginning. A few days had passed since my conversation with David, and I sat by the window, my favorite spot in the house, watching the old trees sway gently in the breeze. The sunlight kissed my skin, offering warmth, but inside I was frozen. I thought about everything that had transpired, the call, the words, the coldness in David's voice. It was clear now that they were trying something again, a new approach. And I knew it wasn't over. David hadn't called again, but I could feel it coming. He was plotting something. He always was. That evening, just as the shadows of dusk began to creep through the house, the phone rang again. I knew who it was before I even picked up the receiver. I had been expecting it. "Mom, are you still upset?" David's voice came through, smooth and persuasive, just like before. "We can't just let this slide, you know. You need to sign a few papers. This will be for your benefit. It's not just about us, it's about you too." His tone made my skin crawl. There was that same twisted familiarity, as if he had every right to ask for anything and everything. as if my entire life's purpose was to serve his needs. But I wasn't that naive woman anymore. I wasn't the woman who waited patiently, hoping for a call, waiting for some sign that they cared. No. Now I was the one who controlled the narrative. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence between us grow thick. "David," I said softly, making sure he could feel the weight of my words. "Don't waste your time. I'm done. This time it's going to be on my terms. I will not be your bank any longer." There was a noticeable shift on the other end. His usual smoothness faltered, and I could hear him stammer, trying to regain control. "But Mom, you don't understand." "No, David," I interrupted, my voice firm now. "I understand perfectly. 4 years I've been your lifeline. But no more. Take what you can from me now, because from here on out you get nothing." He was quiet for a long time, and I could hear the hum of the phone line, the uncomfortable space where words should have been but weren't. I knew he was stunned. David never expected this from me. It was a moment I had been preparing for, and I felt a strange sense of satisfaction as I waited for his reply. "Mom," he finally said, his voice much softer now. "Are you sure? You really want to do this? Maybe you should think it over again. It's not too late to change your mind." I couldn't help but laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had finally woken up. "Too late, David. This time you're not going to win. No more empty promises, no more manipulation. You've pushed me too far. I'm done." With that, I hung up the phone, and for the first time in years, I felt an odd sense of freedom wash over me. The chains they had wrapped around me for so long were gone. It was liberating. My heart raced, but not out of fear. It was exhilaration. For once, I wasn't the one being controlled. I was in charge of my own life. I sat there in the silence of the house, the phone still warm in my hand. There was a calm in the air now, a stillness that hadn't been there before. I wasn't sure what came next, but I knew it was something new. As I sat in the dimming light, I realized I had spent too many years being the one who gave, the one who supported, the one who gave up her own happiness for the sake of their comfort. But no longer. This was the turning point. From now on, it would be different. I wasn't going to let them drain me anymore. They had taken enough. The realization came in waves, each one stronger than the last. I wasn't a bank for them to use. I wasn't a safety net for their failures. I was a person. Someone who had needs, desires, and a life of my own. The next few days passed slowly. I spent them reflecting, gathering my strength. There was no more running on autopilot, no more bending over backward to make their lives easier. I was going to start living for myself. And then another phone call came. I could tell it was from David before I even saw the caller ID. This time I didn't hesitate. I picked up the phone and answered, ready for whatever manipulation he had in store. "Mom." His voice came through, softer this time, almost pleading. "Please just hear me out. We really need your help. Don't you want to make sure everything is taken care of properly?" "David," I said, my voice cold. "I've heard enough. The only thing I need from you is respect. Don't call me again unless it's to apologize for everything you've done." There was no response, just the sound of him hanging up on the other end. I didn't feel angry, or upset, or even disappointed. I simply felt a sense of closure. This was the end of that chapter. It was time to start writing my own story, one that didn't involve their demands and manipulations. Later that evening, I went to the bank. I collected all the paperwork, all the documents that tied me to them, and made sure everything was in my control. I wasn't going to leave anything to chance. They wouldn't get one more cent from me, not unless I chose to give it. I walked out of the bank that night with a sense of finality. A weight lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had power again. And this time, I wasn't going to let anyone take it away. The day after my conversation with David, I could feel a shift in the air around me. Something inside me had changed. For years, I had kept everything to myself, watching my children manipulate my kindness, using it to their advantage without a second thought. But that was it. No more. I was done with being the one they took from. I was done being the bank, the safety net, the emotional cushion they thought they could use and discard. That morning, I set out to make it official. I was going to make a new will, a new statement of intent. This time, my decisions would be mine and mine alone. I had known Lewis, my lawyer, for years, We had shared stories, laughed together, and worked through many challenges. He had seen me go through various phases of life, some happy, some painful, but he was always someone I could trust. So, when I made up my mind, he was the first person I turned to. As I walked into his office, the scent of old leather and paperwork greeted me. Louis was sitting behind his desk, his glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. When he looked up and saw me, his eyebrows raised slightly, a sign that something was different today. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilkins," he said, though his voice betrayed a hint of curiosity. "What brings you in today?" I didn't waste any time. "Louis, I want to make a new will," I said, my voice steady. "I'm ready to take control of everything." He looked at me, his expression one of surprise, but he quickly masked it with professionalism. "What happened? Is everything all right?" I looked him square in the eyes, not bothering to hide the weight of my words. "I've had enough. I'm tired of being the one who's always expected to give. I've decided I'm not going to let my children think they can use me anymore. They've been taking advantage of my kindness for far too long. And it ends now." Louis leaned back in his chair, studying me for a moment. I could see he was processing what I was saying, the wheels turning in his head as he absorbed my words. "You mean all your property, your assets?" he asked cautiously, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "Not just that," I replied, shaking my head. "My freedom. My decisions. I don't want to be the one they come to only when they need something. I'm done being the person they rely on for their own convenience. I want to live the way I choose, not the way they think I should. I want to start over." Louis didn't say anything for a long moment. I could see his mind working through the implications of my request. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I understand. Let me get started on the documents for you." I sat back in my chair, the tension in my chest slowly loosening. It felt strange, almost surreal, to finally be taking control of my life after all these years of living in the shadows of my family's needs. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was doing something for myself. Louis worked quickly, his fingers flying over the keys of his keyboard, drafting the necessary papers. I sat quietly watching him, feeling a strange sense of peace that had eluded me for so long. The weight that had been pressing down on me for years, the constant demands, the manipulations, the feeling of being trapped was starting to lift. By the time I left his office, the papers were ready. I felt a sense of finality, as if a door had closed behind me. My life from this moment forward would be mine to navigate. No more manipulation. No more giving for the sake of others. When I returned home, I found the house eerily quiet. The phone, however, was anything but. The moment I walked in the door, it began to ring. First it was David, then Clara. The same familiar names flashing on the screen. But I didn't pick up. Let them call. Let them try. It was over. I wasn't going to answer their calls. Not now. Not ever again, unless it was to apologize for everything they had put me through. As I sat down at the table with a cup of tea, my mind felt clearer than it had in years. I let out a long breath, feeling the calmness spread through my body, and then just as I began to relax, the phone rang again. This time it wasn't David or Clara. It was an unknown number. I felt a twinge of uncertainty. Something about the unfamiliar number made my instincts prick up. It was a feeling I couldn't explain, but I knew I had to answer. Maybe it was another attempt to reel me back in. But something inside me told me that this call, for some reason, was different. I lifted the receiver and pressed it to my ear. "Hello. Good afternoon," a voice on the other end of the line said, smooth and calculated. "Do you have a moment for an important matter?" I paused, setting my teacup down gently. This wasn't like the other calls I'd received. It wasn't David and it wasn't Clara. The tone of the voice was firm, but there was an underlying sense of urgency that piqued my curiosity. "I'm listening," I replied, my voice measured, careful. The person on the other end took a moment before speaking again. "I'm afraid this isn't a matter that can be discussed lightly. It's regarding your estate and some legal complications that have come to our attention. We need to make sure everything is in order as soon as possible." I felt a chill creep down my spine. Estate complications? Legal matters I wasn't aware of? I had just signed the papers with Louis. Was this some kind of follow-up? My mind raced, but I kept my voice steady. "I'm sorry, but I don't know what you mean. Who is this?" The voice didn't falter. "My name is Mr. Barnes." I represent a firm that has recently taken an interest in some of the transactions involving your assets. It's a delicate situation, and I think it would be in your best interest to meet with us as soon as possible." I could hear the weight in his words. Something about this didn't sit right with me. There was a finality in his tone, as if this conversation had already been set in motion long before I had even picked up the phone. "Mr. Barnes, I'm not interested in discussing anything further at this time. Please do not contact me again." There was a brief silence before the voice on the other end responded. "I understand, Mrs. Wilkins, but you should be aware we are already in motion. You may not have the control you think you do." Before I could say anything else, the line went dead. I sat there stunned. The phone still pressed to my ear, but nothing more. The quiet of the house seemed louder now, like the calm before a storm. What had I just gotten myself into? The voice on the other end of the line was unfamiliar, but it sounded professional, composed. "My name is James Wilson. I represent a legal firm that's been reviewing your financial affairs. There's something important I need to discuss with you." A sense of unease crept over me. "What's this about?" I asked, doing my best to remain calm. 4 years I had managed my own affairs, and now here was someone else calling with what seemed like urgent news. "This concerns your assets, specifically some documents we've come across. We've been reviewing the records of your property, land, and your home. It turns out, you have rights to a significantly larger portion of them than was previously believed." I froze. There was something off about this call. It didn't sound like the usual call from a bank or insurance company. I had always assumed that my assets were under control, that everything was accounted for. And now, here was someone telling me that there were other assets I hadn't even known about? "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" I managed to speak, my voice trembling despite my attempts to stay composed. "Your family, specifically your son David, likely hasn't informed you of all the documents they've been signing behind your back. They might not even be aware that certain deeds of ownership have been transferred, and now you have full legal claim to them." My body went stiff with shock. I couldn't say I was entirely surprised. Over the years, I'd learned that my children weren't above keeping secrets from me, especially when it came to money. But hearing that they might have taken something so significant without my knowledge hit me like a ton of bricks. "Are you saying they've been hiding this from me?" I asked, barely able to comprehend the words coming out of my mouth. James Wilson's voice remained calm, steady. "It seems that way. And now we've found the evidence. You are entitled to the full rights to these properties. Rights you may not have been aware of." I could feel my pulse quickening. I had been so sure of my control over everything. Hadn't I always been the one to ensure everything was in place? To keep track of every detail? Yet here I was being told that there were legal matters hidden from me, right under my nose. "Could I meet with you in person?" I finally asked, feeling a rush of adrenaline. My mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. This wasn't just about money, it was about control. It was about my life, my autonomy, and how it had been so easily manipulated by those closest to me. "Certainly," James responded. "I can come to you tomorrow if that works. I'll bring all the necessary documentation with me. We need to discuss this further." I agreed, and we set the time for the next day. The moment the call ended, I sat down by my window, the weight of the conversation sinking in. I hadn't expected this. I thought I had seen it all, understood it all. But now I was faced with a truth that I couldn't deny. I wasn't just a passive observer in my own life. I was being played, manipulated, and I had been blind to it for far too long. The day felt heavier now. I couldn't stop thinking about what James had said. How could David, my own son, have been involved in something like this? Had they been planning this for years? How many decisions had they made without me, assuming that I wouldn't notice, that I wouldn't fight back? I closed my eyes and tried to push the thoughts away, but they lingered like shadows at the edge of my mind. They had underestimated me. They thought I was weak, that I would always be their convenient source of support. But I wasn't that woman anymore. The next morning I woke up early, a quiet sense of anticipation creeping through my veins. Today was the day I would confront the truth. Today everything would change. I wasn't going to let them take what was rightfully mine. Not anymore. I spent the morning preparing for the meeting. It wasn't just about the legal documents, it was about finally taking a stand. I dressed carefully, making sure I looked presentable, but not overly done up. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was preparing for war, the kind that wouldn't involve any more silent sacrifices. At exactly 10 a.m., James Wilson arrived at my door. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed, with sharp features and an air of confidence that didn't sit well with me. But I wasn't here to be intimidated. I had been intimidated for far too long. "Mrs. Wilkins, it's good to finally meet you in person," he said, extending his hand. I shook it, my grip firm. "Shall we get started?" We sat down in my living room, and he pulled out a thick file of documents. He began speaking, detailing the legal matters I had been unaware of, the properties, the deeds, the transactions that had taken place over the years. As he spoke, I could feel the shock begin to sink in. "So what happens now?" I asked, my voice steady but my mind still reeling from the new revelations. James looked at me seriously. "Now we work on securing your rights. We'll make sure that everything is in order, and if need be, we'll go after any misappropriated assets. The important thing is that you're in control now. It's up to you how we proceed from here." I leaned back in my chair, absorbing the weight of his words. This was it. The moment I had been waiting for. The moment I could finally take back my life, my freedom. I wasn't going to let anyone, especially my own family, take what was mine. "Let's begin," I said, my voice calm and resolute. As James began explaining the steps we would take next, I realized something. This wasn't just about getting what was rightfully mine. This was about reclaiming my power. About showing my family, especially David, that I was no longer the person they could manipulate, the person they could use when it suited them. No, today I was taking control of my destiny. And nothing, not even my own flesh and blood, was going to take that from me again. The next day, when James Wilson arrived at my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was waiting for a catastrophe. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a suit, carrying a briefcase, and he looked like someone who had always worked with wealthy clients. His manners were refined, but there was a calmness in his eyes that I didn't like. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Hayes. I'm glad you agreed to meet," he said, extending his hand. I shook it, but there was no warmth in his gesture, no comfort. Just formality. I didn't want to waste time with pleasantries. I was already bracing myself for something I wasn't prepared to hear. "What exactly have you found?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. The burning desire to understand what was happening was eating away at me. For so many years, my children had been used to me being on their side, always the one they could count on. But it seemed that everything had changed now. Wilson sat down at the table, opening his briefcase and pulling out a stack of papers. He placed them in front of me one by one like they were official documents of some sort. I took one of them, and the moment my eyes landed on the line detailing a property I thought was still in my name, my heart skipped a beat. "This document indicates that the land you thought you owned has been transferred to another owner. However, your name is still listed as the rightful owner of all the assets," Wilson explained, his gaze shifting to mine, and I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. "What do you mean?" My voice caught in my throat, and my heart raced. This can't be true. My children never told me about this. "I understand this might come as a shock," he continued, his voice calm, almost too calm for the magnitude of what he was saying. "But we've found several important documents bearing the signatures of your son David and his wife Clara. They've transferred part of your property to someone else, but the transfer was done incorrectly. As a result, all these assets are now rightfully yours." Coldness flooded my veins, and the room seemed to blur around me. David, my son, the one I had always stood by, had paid the price for his greed. How long had they been manipulating me without my knowing? How many times had they assumed I wouldn't notice? How much had I missed, trusting them blindly? "What now?" I asked, trying to steady my breathing, still in shock, but now a surge of clarity was starting to seep in. "Now it's up to you. You have the right to claim these assets back. You can take them to court and undo the agreements that were made without your consent," James said, his tone as professional as before. I sat at the table, the documents in my hands now feeling like something far heavier than just pieces of paper. I could feel the heat of anger rise in me, the fire in my blood. They had always assumed I wouldn't notice, that I would be the one who simply gave and never asked questions. But now I knew the truth. David and Clara had wanted everything, and I had been kept in the dark like a fool for so long. I looked at the papers in front of me, my mind racing with everything I had learned in the last few minutes. David had been so eager to take everything from me, but now I knew. They had miscalculated. They had underestimated me. I closed the documents slowly, feeling the weight of them but also the newfound strength that was building inside me. "I'm ready for this," I said, my voice firm, resolute. "We're going to court." Wilson looked at me with a slight nod, clearly impressed by my sudden shift in demeanor. "If that's what you want, Mrs. Hayes, we'll proceed. I'll have the necessary paperwork ready for the proceedings. You've been wronged and now it's time to make things right." I stood up from the table, feeling more alive than I had in years. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about my dignity, my autonomy, my right to be treated with respect. For far too long, I had been a passive participant in my own life, but now I was taking control. No longer would I be the one to be manipulated, to be the convenient resource for those who only came to me when they needed something. Now I was the one in the driver's seat. James left after a while, but his visit had left something behind, something powerful. It was like I had been given a second chance. A chance to stand up, to fight for what was mine, to take back my life. As I stood there in the stillness of the room, I realized something else. My children had no idea what was coming. They thought they could push me around, that they could continue their games without consequence. But they were wrong. I wasn't going to let them use me anymore. I wasn't just going to sit back and watch as they took everything I had worked for. No. I was going to make them regret the day they ever underestimated me. It was time to take the gloves off. The next day, I received a phone call from Clara. I had a feeling they would try to contact me, but I didn't expect it to happen so soon. "Mom, how are you?" Her voice was too soft, almost artificially sweet, as if trying to lull me into a false sense of comfort. "David and I are really worried about what happened. We just want to resolve this peacefully. You know, it was all a misunderstanding." I could feel her trying to make me believe her words, but I couldn't listen anymore. The disgust at this manipulation was hard to conceal, and my mind screamed to stop pretending. "Misunderstanding," I replied, trying to keep calm, even though anger boiled inside me. "You mean the misunderstanding where your signatures were on papers that made me the fool? I had no idea you were trying to transfer everything that belonged to me without my consent." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and I could hear the shift in their plans. They didn't expect me to confront them this way. "Mom, don't do this," Clara finally said, her tone shifting. It became more firm, even insistent. "David is really upset. It's hard for all of us. We just want you to sign a few documents, and everything will go back to normal." "Oh, really? And what documents would those be?" I asked, trying not to reveal that I already knew everything. "They're just legal formalities," she answered quickly. "Nothing serious, just to make sure everything is in order. You wouldn't want to make things harder, would you?" Her voice became even more manipulative, as though she was trying to appeal to some guilt buried deep inside me. But I wasn't the same woman anymore. I wasn't going to let her manipulate me into something I didn't want to do. "I've made my decision, Clara, so don't try to manipulate me. You won't get me to sign anything I don't want to." There was a long pause, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had turned sharp, aggressive. "Are you serious? You're going to turn your back on your family? This is your only chance to leave everything as it is. If you don't sign, we lose everything. Do you really want to make us poor?" It was their final attempt to push me, to use guilt as a weapon. But I wasn't falling for it anymore. I sat there in silence, knowing that these words had no power over me. They had already lost that leverage. David and Clara thought I would always be their backup, always available when they needed something. But I was done with that. I've given you everything for all these years. And now I've decided that it's not going to be like that anymore. If you think you can manipulate me into changing my mind, you're sorely mistaken," I said, my voice cold but resolute. Another silence hung in the air. I could feel Clara's frustration through the phone, but it didn't affect me. She had no hold on me anymore. After a few moments, there was a short click as the call ended. It was as though everything had just snapped into place. I realized then that they no longer had control over my life. It was no longer about their needs and desires, it was about mine. They thought I would always be the person who gave without asking questions. They thought they could always use me as their safety net, but I had finally drawn the line. Now I was in charge. They would have to learn to respect that. Several weeks passed since that phone call, and I found myself going through the documents again and again, those I had received from Louise and James Wilson. Every signature, every stamp on those papers gave me new strength. I was no longer the helpless old woman sitting at home, waiting for visits from my children. I was the owner of my life, my property, and my future. Meanwhile, David and Clara kept calling, trying to convince me to sign agreements that would ultimately confirm their claim to my assets. They didn't stop manipulating, using my family duty to try and wear me down. But I remained steadfast. I knew that from now on my decision was the final word. One day, as I sat at the kitchen table, flipping through bills and questioning whether I had made the right choice, I heard a knock at the door. It was Clara. She stood on the doorstep with a beautiful bouquet of flowers, much like the one she used to bring me on holidays. "Mom, we need to talk," she said, a guilty expression on her face. I was ready for this. My hands didn't tremble, though my heart picked up speed. She stepped inside and we sat down at the table. But this time I didn't feel the need to hide my thoughts. "What's going on, Clara?" I asked. We thought this could be resolved peacefully," she began. "But if you want to take everything back, fine. We'll lose everything. David thinks you've made a mistake, but if this is what you want..." There was more fear in her voice than I had expected. "You went to great lengths to take what belonged to me, and you never thought about me, about my wishes. Now I decide not just about the property but everything. I want peace. I want to finish this on my terms," I said calmly. But each word felt like a step toward true independence. Clara tried to say more, but I knew she understood. My resolve was unshakable. That same day, I went to court with all the necessary documents. My children tried to manipulate me a few more times, but each call I ignored. My victory wasn't in the court's ruling. It was in regaining control. Control over my life, my property, and my destiny. In the end, I sold the house that David and Clara had so desperately wanted, and I bought a small home by the lake. The peace I found in the quiet was worth more than any amount of money. I would never again allow anyone to take my freedom. I was no longer a victim. This was my new beginning. The end.
Thanks for watching. Bye bye.